Construction of the tool cabinet starts with the case and the door boxes. In this episode, I'll show you a great way to give your hand-cut dovetails a power assist. The keys are a custom ground table saw blade and a jig for routing out the waste.
We're bringing some of our most popular woodworking content right here to our YouTube channel, starting with this, Mike Pekovich's Hanging Tool Cabinet Video Workshop Series. If you want to build along, we've got links to the plans below. And if you like this type of in-depth content, head on over to findwoodworking.com and sign up for a free 2-week trial of our unlimited membership. You'll get access to over 75 of these long-form video workshop series, and honestly, a whole lot more.
With the stock all milled up and cut to length, I'm ready to go ahead and start dovetailing. First thing I'm going to do is scribe a shoulder line on both the pins and tail boards. Because my dovetails are protruding slightly, I've set my marking gauge slightly wider than the thickness of my stock. On the top and bottom of the case, I won't be scribing along the front face because I won't be removing any stock. With the scribing done, I can go ahead and lay out the tails. It's pretty conventional, except for a couple things. On the case side, we have a regular half pin up at the front, but in the back I have a taft tail where we're going to be rabbiting the inside of that edge. On the doors, I've tightened up the spacing to fit an extra pin in, which is going to strengthen that joint quite a bit. Go ahead and start by laying out the location of the half pin in the front and my pin location at the back. From there, I want to get some evenly spaced pins, and here's a really easy way to do that. Start by marking a line where my front pin is. I take a ruler, and because I want 5 evenly spaced tails, I'm going to set the back of the ruler on the edge of the board and swing it down until the tin hits my front line. From there, it's easy to mark out in 2-inch increments where my pins are going to go. I'm just going to transfer those lines down to my baseline, and I have perfectly spaced pins. No math required. The doors I'm just going to lay out by eye. There's just a couple pins. It should be pretty easy to get it close. And if they're a little bit off, that just adds to the hand-cut look anyway. So that's all the layout we need to do. I'll show you why in a minute at the table saw. I'll be cutting the tails at the table saw, but not just with any old blade. This blade has all the teeth ground at 7.5 degrees. So when I tilt the blade at that same angle, the teeth are now flat at the top. It's going to give me really clean inside corners. So to help support the stock while I'm cutting the tails, I've attached a tall fence to my miter gauge. In addition, I'm attaching a second miter gauge to keep the fence from pivoting under the weight of the workpieces. All right, the next step is to set the blade height. This is really critical. I want it to be right to my scribe line. To help me out, I'm taking the scrap block with my marking gauge set to the same setting and use that to set my blade height. Well, that was a little closer than I expected to get on the first cut, but it's looking good. So let's cut some dovetails. I start by placing the case side with the layout lines in the sled. I line up each tick mark with the kerf in the sled. Then I'll go ahead and make a mark on the fence at the edge of the board. This way I won't need to mark out the rest of the boards. I'll simply align those boards with the tick marks on the fence. I start cutting at the half pin socket, making the initial cut, then sliding the workpiece over to hog out the rest of the waste. Saves a little work later. Next, I'll move from tick mark to tick mark, making a single cut. Once all the cuts have been made, simply rotate the piece, align the saw kerf in the workpiece to the saw kerf in the sled, make another cut, you've got a V. Now just continue on down the line. With those cuts done, flip the board end for end. Make sure you're cutting the half pin on the same side as the one on the top. A coping saw and chisel will make quick work of the waste, so we can get started on the pins. I always work with the outside face or show face facing towards me or up on the bench. So if I do any overcutting, it happens on the inside corner or you're not going to see it. Go ahead and flip the workpiece. Make sure you made it all the way down to your baseline on the other side too. All right, let's get started on the pins. When scribing the pins, first thing I do is put a scrap the same thickness as a workpiece on the opposite side of the vise. This keeps it from racking. Secondly, I elevate the workpiece above the bench, aligning it with the top of a support block. The tails board will rest on top of that. And finally, because I can only fit part of this side into my vise, I want to keep the outside from flexing too much. So I use a spacer block between the workpiece and the front of my bench. I'm really concerned about aligning these parts nice and square before I scribe. Otherwise, the case may end up racked once I'm done cutting the joinery. I've got three things that are helping me out. First, I'm using a combination square set up against my tail board to make sure that it's in alignment. Secondly, I'm using my thumbs on the back of the board to make sure the reveal is nice and even. The third trick I have is to get a clamp-on light and shine it underneath the workpiece. Seems a little bit odd, but what happens is it makes a nice line of light where my gaps are. So with those three tools in hand, I'm pretty confident I can get a nice square joint. I marked the waist areas. This helps remind me which side of the scribe line to saw on. In addition, I'll carry a line from the scribe line down to the baseline as a vertical guide when sawing. When I saw the pins, I like to saw right up against the scribe line, rather than sawing out from the line and leaving a lot of waste to pare later. All right, now the tough part's done. We still have a whole lot of waste to remove. I'm going to go to the bandsaw to remove most of it, then follow up with a router right to the baseline. I could simply route out the waste between the pins, but to save some time, I'm going to bandsaw out most of it. The trick here is to make sure that the wide end of your pins is facing up so you don't inadvertently cut into them when you're bandsawing out the waste. So to help me route out the waste, I've got a support stand which is going to hold the workpiece for me. It's got a base which is wide enough to clamp to the workbench, a broad face that I can clamp my workpiece to with a fence which will help for alignment. It's got a broad top which the router base sits on to let me route out the waste. It's important that the top of the pins are dead flush with the work surface. I have a spiral straight bit mounted in my router, and I've set the depth exactly to my scribe line. Now it's just a matter of routing out the waste. This is where these ears come in handy because it's difficult to see where the router bit is cutting at the bottom of the joint, but I can tell when it begins to cut into these little ears, I know I'm really too much further into my pin. Cool, we've got a nice smooth baseline, just a little bit of waste in the corners I'm going to get rid of with a knife and a chisel, then we can check the fit. Now before I even try for the fit, I'm going to take a look at the walls of the pins. The thing I'm looking for is to make sure that I sawed nice and vertically. If I'm angled out a little bit, which is really common, I'm going to go ahead and pare those walls straight without really removing any material from the tops of the pins at all. Then I'll try the fit. All right, let's give it a fit. Now at this point, I'm not really expecting it to fully seat, but because I sawed right to my scribe lines, I am hoping to get at least part of the joint seated. That's going to give me a guide when I pair the other joints to fit. Actually, the whole thing's seated, which is really great. I'm not going to try and force the whole thing down because it still feels pretty tight. Instead, I'm going to use a pencil to mark between the tails to show me just where I need to pair. I'm going to go ahead and clamp it just to get rid of some of that wobble. Now I've got some nice pencil marks on my pins to tell me exactly where to pair, and I'm not going to be pairing on areas that I don't need to. That's nice. Now the pins are proud right now. Instead of flushing those off, I'm going to leave them that way. I think it looks kind of cool. So basically, with this done, our case joinery is done. We're almost ready for glue up. The next episode, we're going to add the fixed shelf, glue everything together, and we're going to start outfitting the inside. Stick around.